Well, hello, everybody. My name is Mike Sheila. I am the Director of Marketing and Business Development for Advantage Industries, which is an MSSP here in Columbia, Maryland. And I look forward to our partnership webinar series with Dell Technologies. Every month, we get a different subject matter expert. And this month, we have something truly unique, I believe, because we've had some very smart men come on our show and talk about different aspects of technology as they apply. But today, for you business executives, for you CIOs, you CTOs, we truly have a peer. We have the global healthcare CTO for Dell Technologies, Mr. Stephen Lazar. Stephen's been with Dell for many, many years. And to have his insights today around an industry that frankly needs a lot of help is absolutely wonderful. When you talk about medical and all of the aspects of the business world that impacts, I think a lot of businesses don't realize that under HIPAA guidelines, they are what's known as a business associate, which means that they too have to follow HIPAA guidelines. So problem number one, get the medical community to follow HIPAA in unison. Problem number two, get all their business associates to get on board with this platform, because it is critical not only to protecting your brand, protecting your company's revenue, but protecting your patients. That I think that's the thing that gets overlooked the most, is that the reason HIPAA exists is to protect the privacy of patients. And because technology has gotten so sophisticated, we'll say, particularly in the last 10 years, HIPAA becomes more and more important every day. So with that, Stephen Lazar, thank you so much for being on today. And we really look forward to hearing your conversation, what you're going to share with us today.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I do appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you and your customers, and also want to offer it up that if there are follow-on questions or concerns that others would like to address, please just reach out through Mike, and he will engage me, and we can certainly have a further conversation.
Yeah, for those of you that are new and haven't seen our other episodes, Advantage Industries is a Dell partner. We work hand in hand with them on practically a daily basis to support our clients. And we get great resources like Steve. So Steve, take it away.
And with that, by way of introduction, Mike, you've already introduced me by name. I am Stephen Lazar. My role is Global Healthcare and Life Sciences CTO with Dell Technologies. With that, I come at this primarily from the provider side of the world, where I've spent my last 25 years working in healthcare, coming up through the technology side, including defining and developing some of the technologies that we now look at as commonplace, and really have had the luxury of working with healthcare for a very, very long time. My role is very much global, and because of that, I have the opportunity to work with customers around the world, look at the problems that are around the world, and spend time thinking about how do we solve those problems on a global basis. The thing that you'll learn about healthcare as you start to expand around the globe is that although the dialects are different, the cultures are different, and most of them pretty wonderful, the challenges and problems of healthcare are generally the same. And as we jump through this, we'll definitely spend some time talking about some of the challenges that we all have. But we want to talk a little more about privacy and security, because healthcare at this time is one of the most frequently attacked businesses within the world itself. And if you think there's any joke to that, just talk to our friends over in Ireland, who recently had a national issue, not to mention the multiple issues I hear about every week here in the U.S., where healthcare privacy is attacked. And Mike, you started to allude to it earlier about being able to protect our privacy. HIPAA is one of the frameworks that is utilized to help drive that requirement for protection of data, but it's only one of several. And we're going to talk about a few more from the data privacy and data security perspective during our conversation here. Good, bad, or indifferent, the value of healthcare data, unfortunately, is the highest value data on the black market today. Typical healthcare record will sell for around $250 to $300 US on the black market, as compared to a credit card and a credit card identity theft, which will only sell for about $15, believe it or not.
Hey, Steve, let's pause there for just a second, because you bring up something that I'm guessing, if our audience is populated with C-level executives, so CTO, CIO, the CISO, they're probably aware of that. But if you're not in those categories, there is this very ugly thing called the dark web. And this is where these things are bought and sold moment by moment. Criminals working with other criminals. They will actually get a hold of somebody's personal health information. They'll get what they can out of it, and then they'll go and they'll put it on this market and say, hey, who else wants to buy this, and see what you can get out of it, because maybe you're going after different things that I am. And
that is a pretty common case that we see, Mike. It is something that is unfortunately all too familiar. Some of the challenges that we see with that are the challenges around organizations that are utilizing this to go ahead and create identities and literally billing for things that have never happened. Things like actually a case of an organization in Florida that I'm aware of. The organization had billed millions of dollars to Medicare, Medicaid using false identities, and had actually presented a case of where a person had gone through an amputation of both arms and one leg, and they had actually not had any interaction with the healthcare system. They were a perfectly healthy, normal adult in reality. Yet
with
the
all
healthcare
arms
organization, with all arms and legs intact, yes. But the organization that had sent in that billing was able to collect millions from Medicare for that one person. It's pretty amazing as you start to think about these things and what happens in the world. It's pretty crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and pop to our agenda here, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in the market. We won't spend a whole lot of time on that. It sounds like, Mike, your audience has a bit of information on that already, but we will also talk about HIPAA and some of the other frameworks, talk about some cybersecurity investments. We're also going to talk about a concept that we refer to as secure care. And it is something that's just really a way to think about healthcare security and privacy and ways that we can help provide those capabilities. It will involve some Dell Technologies products, but we'll talk about what that is and what that framework looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what Dell Technologies does and what we do with our partners.
Steve, I love the fact that you made the second one HIPAA and other frameworks, because again, problem number one, let's get all the medical facilities to embrace HIPAA and really work at it. Problem number two, let's get all the business associates to embrace HIPAA and really work at it. And then problem number three is HIPAA is not the one and done. It's not the only way that we go about securing. I'm very fond of saying it's never either or, it's and both. You know, when you look at HIPAA, it was born out of the NIST guidelines, and NIST is the granddaddy of compliance, as it were. And from that, PCI has sprung, and GDPR has sprung, and CMMC, and basically every other acronym that you can think of. And they all bring value to a company. So depending on your size and the sophistication, and by size, I mean staff as well as revenue, those things come into play more and more. And it may not be just one compliance that you want to follow.
In most cases, there will be a mix, I think. And when HIPAA first came out, and I was around working in healthcare when HIPAA first came out from a regulatory perspective, it was a rather interesting conversation around compliance or lack thereof. It was a choice to comply. It was a choice to not comply. And in many organizations, at least in the first few years when HIPAA came out, chose not to comply, believe it or not. Some of the challenges that HIPAA brought forward, exactly, it was the cost of implementation and the return on investment based upon that implementation. Now that the cyber criminals have caught up with the capabilities within the healthcare system, realize the value of electronic medical records, it makes much more sense to comply. It makes it much more cost effective to comply. And we'll get into some of that here as we go forward. And I'm just going to spend 1 minute on some of the things that we're seeing in the healthcare security landscape. This only goes to December of 2020. I'm not going to read through the slideware here. I am aware of an organization that I've worked heavily with in the past, not recently, but in past history, who recently was attacked. They were attacked by a malware storm, and with that, they did lose control of their data. It's been about 3 weeks now that I'm aware of that they have restored some partial functionality, but in general, they're almost out of business. And it is a large healthcare system. I'm not going to go into names. We're not going to talk about it, but no one wants the bad publicity because that's a big interaction there, and it really is about protecting brand more than anything else. Some of the things that you see going on within the world that make the press really are more about brand impact than they are about data loss and or the cost of recovery. The cost of brand loss far exceeds the cost of recovery in most cases.
Yeah, Steve, I want to point out something that you just mentioned there. So 69% of global IT decision makers lack confidence that they could reliably recover. So let's, for our audience today, many of you are in the IT leadership role. And this is the most frustrating thing because I think the overwhelming majority of you recognize my department needs to be better. But when you go to the CFO or the COO or the COO and say, I need this money for these things, they all laugh. And there's this, well, it's never going to happen to us. Why would I spend that? Why would I give you an extra $1 million a year in your budget, Mr. CIO or Mrs. CIO? What's our return on investment on that? I've got to do research and development. I've got to pay doctors. I've got to pay nurses. I've got to pay for all the things that go into supporting that brick and mortar on a daily basis. Why am I just going to throw money down a dark hole so that you can feel better about your cybersecurity? I'd much rather just fire you when something goes wrong and have a scapegoat.
That is a very true statement. At the same time, however, those perceptions in the boardroom are changing.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
They are very definitely changing. As a matter of fact, I was talking with another customer last week who urgently sent out a message requesting a proposal for some isolated data recovery capabilities and being able to provide that air-gapped copy of data because the board had brought this up. They had brought it up to the board several months ago. The board turned them down. All of a sudden, the board members are now bringing this up as something that we need to do in some way, that we need to go forward and really start to look at how we protect ourselves. Only because another healthcare system nearby had recently taken a very significant hit. It can happen to you.
Yeah, sometimes you need
it's
to.
It's not a matter of if,
friends,
it's a matter of when. Yeah, well, it's never been a matter of if. Several years ago, I was presenting to another healthcare organization. We were talking about security and what they should consider doing, or at least think about doing. And as I finished my conversation, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. 2 weeks later, unbeknownst to me, they were down hard, and they were down hard for several weeks because their CIO had taken the same position that you had mentioned in that, why do we need to throw money down this black hole? He was looking for a new role very shortly thereafter. It is something that will happen. It is something that healthcare systems are attacked on a daily basis. Average number of attacks on a single healthcare system are over 600 per day for malware attacks. Most of them you don't notice, most of them you fend off. However, the one time that someone clicks on that phishing attempt, things will go bad, and they will go bad quickly. As I mentioned, the number of attacks, 560 cyber attacks on healthcare organizations weekly, I'm sorry, not daily, weekly. The numbers that are fended off are really unbelievable. And as you start to think about what the cost of those breaches are, and this is a number from 2019, in 2020, we've seen over 500 data breaches in 2020. I don't have 2021 numbers yet. If you want to find out who's been breached and who's been breached when, simply go out to the web and search on Wall of Shame. Everyone is required to report their breaches, and that is where they are all posted. It is part of the Health and Human Services organization that is carrying that information and reporting on that information as they are driving what is HIPAA. All right, we're not going to spend any more time on statistics, and we'll keep moving here. So, talking about cybersecurity standards and frameworks, I mean, really what people are looking at, and as you mentioned, Mike, there are a number of frameworks that are out there, and whether we're talking about frameworks from HIPAA, from NIST, from HITRUST, from CMMC, which is a new one that people are probably not real familiar with, or a newer one. It is something that we're starting to see more and more uptake of the frameworks. Most organizations have been trying to follow NIST standards, and really all they are recommendations of providing the capabilities and looking at if they are certifications involved, they are really certifications of maturity. They're looking at how controls are provided. And really what we're looking at is how do we get the right training and prevention strategies? How do we get an incident response plan, as well as a protected and isolated copy of the data or backup of the data, depending upon what perspective we're looking at this with. Those to me are really the places and really the things that really, really matter as we get into this conversation.
Steve, I'm glad you mentioned that. In general, this is broad strokes I'm painting here.
Yeah.
I think most of the technology that's in place is the right technology. There are some exceptions to that, certainly. But I think where people lack is they're not getting into the policies and procedures and not being granular enough. I may think I told you this story. I went to see my back doctor, and because we were in COVID, they emailed me my intake form, which was asking for, amongst other things, my social security number, my address, my insurance information, my phone number, all unencrypted. And I said, I'm not filling this out. And when I get to the office, right next to the copier machine is a great big gray trash can with no top on it that says to be shredded. Anybody could walk in, pretend to be the shred guy, and walk out with all the data. So if you thought it was important enough to shred, guess what? It's important enough to steal.
It is. That is one of those challenges, is really getting to look at all of the areas that we have exposure. And that is really where we started to develop this concept of what we'll talk about here in just a little bit around secure care. The other thing that we're seeing, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the other thing that we're seeing is really around the investment areas for things like cybersecurity. If we take a look at it from the NIST perspective, and really looking at the NIST framework, the identify and protect areas have really seen a reasonable amount of investment. However, the areas that really have not seen any investment, or at least not enough investment around the recovery and response, especially from a healthcare perspective, is really around that recovery and respond capability. How do we get ourselves back to business? How do we be able to go ahead and really start to recover and get ourselves back to normal operation? This healthcare system that I've mentioned earlier that is still recovering from this attack, I'm guessing they've got at least another month or so to finish recovery before they're back to full operating mode. And with that, they are literally losing thousands of dollars a day. Right now, I think they've actually been able to reinstate things like elective surgeries and reinstate other procedures, other non-critical procedures, and be able to go ahead and start to deliver those. But that impact and the brand loss, just because of that impact, have been staggering to them. I would estimate that they've lost anywhere up to about $500 million.
Yeah, Steve, I love your statistic here that on average companies spend $9.6 million or $515 per employee in 2020. I think it would be a great piece of research to understand, of that 9.6 million, how much of it was proactive dollars spent by companies that were trying to prevent, and how much of it was reactive because they were forced, because they were cited in a breach, an attorney knocked on their door and mandated an audit, and then their cyber insurance company said, all right, we're going to have to put you through an audit. We have to pay out this claim. So of that
Yep.
9.6 million, how much of it was actually proactively versus, because I'm willing to bet most of it was reactively spent.
I expect a good portion of it was. I think a lot of it now is fear and trepidation has really started to drive that spend, though, significantly greater. There's been enough in the press. The CISA warning that came out recently, as well as another one that was posted in the last 2 weeks. And CISA, for those that are not aware, Computer Information Security Association, has posted some threat warnings. The last one was really more around the utility side of the world, but as you look at healthcare, healthcare is one of those critical infrastructure pieces that is like a utility. And as you look at how this is playing out with those warnings, the organizations are really starting to stand up and pay attention to these conversations. There have been so many data losses, so many impacts, and the impacts have been very, very significant. It's no longer a conversation around how are we doing, and we might have some concerns of an attack. It is, what are we going to do to stop the next attack? And how do we be preventative at this point? It's something that we do need to increase the spend from a healthcare perspective, but at the same time, we also need to continue to evolve and grow. You know, good, bad, or indifferent, cybersecurity is like a race of hurdles. And each one is a little bit higher and a little bit higher and a little bit higher. And you're laughing at me, Mike, but that's what it is. It's how do we create enough hurdles that those cyber criminals and those that wish to do harm to the organizations give up and go somewhere else?
Yeah.
That's really it, because they're going to go somewhere else. This is business for them. This is on the order of organized crime. It is well invested. It is well funded. Because frankly, just like with this pipeline discussion, I think they paid out what, $4 million or $5 million to be able to
$4.8 million.
And just like that, when healthcare records are exposed, there is a lot of loss there. There's a lot of expense there, and the encryption capabilities of being able to lock up that data and not have it available has happened to a number of organizations. And how do we go about preventing that? I mean, what you need to do is really start to look at how you view security rather than from an afterthought and a burden, but how do we turn that into more of a conversation around innovation and an accelerator? And as you look at it from our perspective, we think that you need to be able to protect any device, any application running on any cloud, running on a trusted infrastructure, no matter what we do. This is something that it needs to be an intrinsic part of everything that you do, about every application that you build or every application you utilize, everything that you bring forward. Security needs to be a forethought, not an afterthought in that discussion. Now, I mentioned the concept of secure care. And what secure care really is from a Dell Technologies perspective is really just a way for us to identify and really think through how does security play in from Dell Technologies perspective, because we have a lot of these products that are available to us. We also have the NIST framework. So how do we tie all this together so it's understandable, so it's manageable, and be able to go ahead and really spend some time thinking about this. But as we start to think about what we're trying to protect and who we're trying to protect, we do start off on the identify path where we're looking at protecting the staff, the clinical devices, the network, the data center, and getting into the protection side of things, again, with the staff and the client device, the data center, the network, et cetera. And as we continue down the path from the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover frameworks from NIST, how do we bring all this together into something that's a little bit more of a cohesive picture? And for anyone that thinks that this stuff is something that we don't eat our own dog food, frankly, I get phishing emails from our internal teams, and they're intentional, from our internal teams on the average of once to twice a quarter. And it's up to us to figure out, is this a phishing email, and report it or not? Should it be a phishing email or something that is going to violate security policy and you don't report it, you are sent to additional training, believe it or not, to make sure that you become aware. This is how you get that staff aware. I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about some products, and I really don't want to go too deep into Dell Technologies products, but some of the things that we bring forward from a product perspective really are, to me, I'll say, in the cutting edge and really helping us start to look at how we tie not only all of this back to NIST, but really to a secure environment to go ahead and provide that.
Steve,
the product that I talked
to
about.
Point out a takeaway that our audience should get from the last slide that you just showed and the one that you're on right now. There is no magic bullet to this. Dell has put a tremendous amount of time, effort, research, and energy into developing a stack that can be a solution, a comprehensive solution for a client. And Advantage has done the same thing. I mean, very candidly, Steve is talking with companies globally around the world with thousands of employees. And I'm fighting the good fight here in the Columbia, Maryland area for the small to medium business clientele. And the common denominator here is getting a firewall doesn't solve your problems, and signing on for security training doesn't solve your problems, and getting multi-factor authentication turned on doesn't solve your problems. Now, all three of those things are critical, but I think one of the other myths that a lot of business owners or a lot of business executives fail to recognize is there's at least 100 things that go into creating an impactful solution, as shown by your infographic here, which has over 100 things on it.
Yeah, I don't honestly know the number of things that are on it, but we're really trying to look at ways that we can start to impact every layer of what is necessary to provide that secure environment. And that's really what it's about. You know, you heard me talking about the hurdles before. Well, this is how we start to identify those layers of technology or layers of things that we need to protect. Security is not a single solution by any stretch of the imagination. Privacy is not a single solution by any stretch of the imagination. It's only through a combination of approaches that we are able to not only keep the malactors out, but train the staff to be able to stop things before they start, be able to utilize things like thermal vision capabilities to go ahead and protect the staff from a physical issue, especially as we've talked about pandemic discussions. But all these things come together to be able to provide those protections, provide that safety, provide, providing capabilities that we can utilize in order to detect things before they ever become that problem. And with that, this collection of product and collection of solutions really is that process to be able to provide as much as possible around being able to close down those loopholes. Look at this as though we're looking at a flood trying to get into someone's house. If we're tightly sealed up, chances are we'll keep the water out and we'll be able to protect what's inside. Now we have to be able to get out of the house and be able to go out and explore the world as well. At the same time, that water is going to keep trying to get in no matter where, and water will find its way. Given any opportunity, given any chance, given any crack in the foundation, any possible leaks or cracks in the walls or wherever it is, we're trying to keep these things out rather than letting them in and letting them become a problem. At the same time, we talk about doing things like putting out places like honeypots where we can direct things where they'll hopefully do the least amount of harm if they do happen to get in. But all these pieces need to come together and really need to become that overall part of what we're delivering in order to be able to create that environment that is secure. And that will meet the requirements of HIPAA and probably exceed them quite significantly, so that when there is an incident, and I'm not saying if, but when there is an incident, you can show that you've taken all the proper protections. You will not be fined by the HIPAA police, and be able to go ahead and continue on in business. And your audit will show that you've done everything possible or everything that you can in order to keep as much as possible out. One of the biggest leakage points that I think that we have, though, is the one that we've talked about a little bit already, and that is around staff. We all get those very interesting emails, and sometimes we look at them and scratch our heads and wonder a little bit, should I click on this? And unfortunately, someone typically does. the more we learn about that, the more we test that capability, the more we educate our teams around that, the more protected we will be, because typically that's how these things start.
Your water metaphor again, right? You know, if
Yes.
you've got a staff of 100 people, odds are you only need one person out of the 100. The other 99 could have known what not to do. That one person, and that's why you're in the situation you're in. And you made a very interesting point there. The HIPAA police coming and levying a fine on you. That is the tip of the iceberg, because that's presuming that nobody that was involved in the breach went out and hired an independent attorney to sue you because their data was compromised. That is assuming that your cyber insurance policy company doesn't come back to you and say, well, we need you to run a secondary audit to make sure that you're following all the rules and regulations that are in our insurance policy, because otherwise we're going to deny your claims. So now you're in double jeopardy, and I guess you could say triple jeopardy, because you're going to have to pay HIPAA, you're going to have to pay for this audit that the cybersecurity company is demanding, and you're going to have to pay out these people that have hired attorneys to pursue you legally. Putting all of that aside from the brand damage and your inability to do your job for a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Yes, no, it is quite the challenge. And unfortunately, good, bad, or indifferent, I'm not certain that anyone will ever come through an audit 100% clean, but they will come through, some can come through quite clean and be able to go ahead and protect themselves and be able to protect their organization and be able to utilize that insurance capability in order to help fund some of the losses that will definitely be incurred. There's no question there.
What HIPAA calls
other organizations, if they haven't,
appropriate action.
I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
What HIPAA calls taking reasonable and appropriate action.
Yes. And hopefully with that, we have the opportunity here to be able to provide that relatively secure environment. And then between that and your capability to provide things like that offline air-gapped copy of data, which will allow you recovery, suddenly can be something that is very much a savior, believe it or not. And those are, to me, are the real challenges around where we go from a security perspective. Now, working with Dell Technologies, working with our partners, such as Mike's team there at Access, along with what we can bring forward from a Dell Technologies perspective, because Dell Technologies can offer some services in this area, but our services are somewhat limited, which is where we rely on partners like Access in order to help us out and be able to provide those capabilities out in the field and really be able to drive those, the implementation of those solutions that are necessary in order to go ahead and protect your environment, but also at the same time, really make that into a holistic approach in delivering not only security, but data privacy as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Steve, that if some company claims that they can do it all for you, and they're not transparent about how many partners they're using to really provide you a solution, they're either A, not giving you the complete picture, or B, they're not giving you a complete solution. And both of those are bad.
Both of those lead to the same problems that we've just talked about and lead to the cracks in the wall where the water's coming in. Unfortunately, it leads us right back to that same conversation.
And not enough fingers to plug all the holes.
That's correct. That's correct. Even if you're using your toes. Nowadays with Zoom, no one even knows if I'm wearing shoes. No, just kidding here. But as we look at this, and as we look at how this needs to be thought about and brought forward, it really is a layered approach. Just because we have a firewall, well, that's okay for some things around the perimeter. Just because we have some intrusion detection capability, that's okay for some things around the perimeter. It's not going to stop that malware email that comes in through another path that is open and able to accept those types of things. We need to think about this as a very holistic approach and multiple layers of defense. Now, I know that we talk with organizations that say, well, I have a backup copy. Well, you have a backup copy that is going to be not only air-gapped, but also be able to detect changes in itself that have occurred over time, not just from a growth perspective, but changes to the data itself, that is where things start to get very critical and how we go ahead and manage this. This is how we talk about things like our cyber vault capabilities in providing an air-gapped data copy that is immutable, believe it or not. It's something that we've actually tested with Safe Harbor from the financial perspective. It is a qualified product from their perspective for Safe Harbor as a way to protect financial data. We are now applying that to healthcare, and we are starting to see huge uptake in that discussion. It is something that is, from a data protection perspective, it is about the best thing that we have available on the market today, and the best thing that is on the market today from our perspective, in order to provide that immutable copy of data that you can recover from. If everything else fails, that's your last line of defense. Data backups are not enough because chances are malware was seeded months before it was activated, if not years before it was activated. The criminals are getting smarter. They're getting much, much smarter. Initially during the pandemic, cyber criminals said that they would lay off of healthcare because healthcare was struggling to try and support the world. They did anything but. And they really changed their tune and really came after healthcare extremely ferociously. I don't know how else to describe it. This is really what's caused us to have this response and really caused us to change our perspective on security within healthcare and really spend a tremendous amount more time talking about it and making sure our customers actually implement it. And Mike, I'm sure your customer base also has concerns, questions, challenges, opportunities there about ways that they can protect themselves, and want to make sure that we think through this and think through it in a very holistic manner.
Yeah, I think you just brought up a very interesting subject there, Steve, is these organized criminals are being very strategic in how they're going about getting their money. As a result, we need to be very strategic with our customers. Mm-hmm. We need to be more strategic. It's a game of chess at this point. We have to outthink them. We have to be 3 or 4 moves ahead to minimize the risk. Because as you pointed out, it's going to happen to every business at some point. The question is, what is the extent and what is the duration? How deep did the hacker get, and how long did they get to play around and pull data?
There is one other key point I want to bring up, is that sure. From an organizational perspective, we need to be 3 or 4 steps ahead every single day. They only need to get ahead one time, and only one time. They only need to have one small crack to get in. And once that crack has been opened, unfortunately, the challenges are great.
That one employee out of the 100 that opened up the email that they shouldn't have.
And clicked on the link, yes. The one thing I could advise your customers on is really think this through, really spend some time on it and invest. It will pay back. It will dramatically, and I mean really dramatically pay back. Dell Technologies, as I said, has taken a very much a renewed approach to this over the last 12 months, especially as we've seen the challenges really start to ramp up. And this is really what caused us to develop what we call Secure Care, and really looking at how we can build intrinsic security into all of your healthcare IT approaches and solutions. Frankly, even things like our supply chain, meaning the chips that go into your laptop, are very, very tightly protected from the point of design, manufacture, and delivery to assure that there are no surprises in there. You heard a lot of discussion around Huawei being able to provide backdoors based upon where the product is manufactured, especially as we were starting to talk about 5G networks. We have those same concerns on laptops, desktops, data storage equipment, data protection equipment. All those same concerns exist, and Dell Technologies takes a very serious approach to protecting that supply chain. As chance would have it, I sat next to a gentleman responsible for that supply chain on an aircraft one day, heading down to Austin, Texas, and we had a very, very in-depth conversation about what goes on to protect that supply chain. As we start to think about things like risk assessments and risk capabilities, and really starting to develop new operating models, we need to think about how we apply security to those new operating models. the overall pandemic has really opened up healthcare to many, many new edge opportunities and or challenges as they may be. We took and moved all of our clinicians off premise as quickly as possible. We sent our radiologists to go home to read and gave them a reading workstation at their house and a high-speed network connection in order to be able to get those images there, to be able to read those things. What did we do to secure their environment? What did we do to secure the, well, in Dell's case, 160,000 employees that we sent home over a 2-week period? How do we protect all that communication? How do we protect all that information? How do we have deployment-ready tools to be able to provide these controls and really start to think about it from a capability perspective? How do you provide all of that and do so in a manner that has been sped up by a factor of about 15 or 20 to 1 compared to what it used to be.
A revolution over the last 18 months.
Yes, it's been amazing. And in addition to that, I mean, where do we find the experts? And we do have experts from a data governance and controls perspective, and we can certainly provide some capabilities there, as can Mike from Access, and be able to support your businesses and help your businesses become more secure. It really is going to come back to those tool sets and your utilization of those tool sets. And I can't say those words strongly enough. Unfortunately, within the data security arena, shelfware is rampant. And I do mean rampant in that we bought it, but we didn't do anything with it. How do we get beyond that point? How do we develop that secure environment? And your CIO is going to go to bed thinking, okay, well, I spent the $500,000 you asked me for to go ahead and buy whatever product it was, Mr. CISO. How do we go ahead and make sure that that is actually doing the job? How do we validate that it's actually going to deliver on the requirements that are necessary? That one piece of advice is making sure that you take this seriously, take the spend seriously. It is going to be probably the cheapest insurance that your organization will ever spend money on. At the same time, it doesn't really show a difference in the bottom line until something happens.
Yeah, I think the best thing that any client that you or I work with, Steve, is 12 months after they sign an agreement with us, say, nothing happened. That's validation that we're doing our job because nothing happened.
That's a great story. Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that. And especially at Dell Technologies, we do something around validation of the value of what we've done. And we always go back and we ask questions. We always talk to our customers after we have implemented certain projects to make sure that there is value coming back out of those. Not that our customers are willing to speak about what they've done from a controls perspective to be able to provide those secure and protected environments. Frankly, they don't want anyone else to know. But with that, we do go back and make sure that it's very important for us to understand that there was value delivered, that these projects that we bring forward do actually deliver on what we've stated they will, and that the customers are getting value and being able to secure their environments based on this.
And Steve, I love your point about supply chain, because I think that's something that maybe the average executive doesn't think of. I actually had a client that had engaged us to talk specifically about cybersecurity from a compliance perspective. They wanted to get up to snuff. And myself and my engineer, we were speaking with the CIO of this company, about 350 employees, 5 locations across the United States. That's the marketplace we're talking about in this example. And as we're speaking with the CIO, we're sitting in his office. One of the people from his IT team walks past his desk, stops to say hello to us, looks at the CIO and says, Bill, those IP cameras that we ordered for the California office. He goes, yes. The ones we got from Korea. He goes, yes. They have firmware on them that is sending IP information back to Korea. They came out of the box with malware built in them. So controlling that supply chain. And I'd like to say that's an isolated incident, but it's not. And that's to your point, controlling your supply chain.
Looking at where data is going, and this is another one of our partners, a group called Medigate. We look at clinical devices with Medigate and look at where the traffic is going, or where traffic is designed to go coming in and out of those devices. We engage that with some of our network microsegmentation capabilities in order to provide the correct and secure pathway for that data. And every once in a while, we catch information coming out of whether it's a CT scanner or whether it's an MRI device or some other form of device that we're looking at from a medical device perspective that's communicating with China at 3 a.m. And we wonder why. I mean, you're laughing, but that story is unfortunately all too common.
Yeah, and that is why
understand what's going on. Control that traffic. You know, information needs to flow freely within the organization. It does not necessarily need to flow freely outside the organization. Now, as we get into cloud conversations and as we get into edge conversations, the challenges become a little more difficult. At the same time,
absolutely.
There are ways to protect that information. There are ways to be able to control that data flow and really start to look at things like that. As we start down the pathway of things like IoT capabilities, where we're starting to collect data from patients. I spend a lot of time working on things like virtual care capabilities. As we start down that discussion, the validation and trust capabilities of the data that is being supplied start to come into question, because we're starting all the way out at the edge with either a consumer or another organization. How do we know that that information coming off of that device is actually accurate, real, and to the point? Whole nother discussion for another day.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a subject that we could literally talk about for hours and not exhaust all the points that you need to look at. So from a big picture perspective, because we only have a few minutes left, I think you can boil this down to a few key things. Is that being proactive is way less expensive than being reactive. And
by far.
Whatever your strategy is now, you want to 10x that. Whatever you're doing now, you want to become 10 times more strategic. You want to talk to people like Steve. You want to talk to people like myself. And don't be afraid to show your dirty underwear. I think that's another challenge that a lot of our clients is they don't want to admit to us, well, I really don't know this. You know what? That's okay. The more you are willing to say, hey, I want your help, the better the solution is going to be tailored to not only your specific company, but to the needs of your specific company. And that's going to make it 10 times more effective, which is going to reduce your loss. It's going to minimize your exposure. It's going to protect your brand. And ultimately, it's going to help drive revenue.
Yes, it will. And with that, Mike, do we want to open up the floor for questions, or should we
certainly
conclude?
happy to give folks a chance to ask questions if they have them. I will say that if you are shy and don't want to ask in this venue today, Steve and I are easy to contact. Steve, I know you have one that shows your contact information. You can contact Advantage Industries through answers@getadvantage.com, a nice simple email. Certainly visit our website, visit the Dell Technologies website, because as you can see, Steve is exceptionally experienced in this subject, and it is critical to the success of your organization. And think of it this way, it truly is an investment that when done properly will help drive revenue and protect revenue for your organization.
It is all about protecting the organization, protecting the data, protecting your brand. And that's really what you need to think about, is how do you make sure that even though we have challenges from all sorts of places on the outside, how do we keep ourselves in the clear here and be able to share information, not only with only those that we need to share information with, and in ways that we need to share information.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. You were nothing short of brilliant today, and we appreciate your insights. And to our viewing audience, thank you so much for participating. Feel free to share this video with your colleagues and tell them how exceptionally brilliant you thought Steve was. And feel free to reach out to us and ask questions at any time. And we will be back next month with Advantage Industries' ongoing presentation series, where we partner with Dell Technologies and bring you the best and the latest in technology and cybersecurity. For Stephen Lazar, I am Mike Sheila with Advantage Industries, and thank you all so much for your time today.